Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with some more news about the CCP virus and the possible complications it presents. One of these is patients are developing rashes that may be indicative of blood clotting. It's been established now for several weeks, if not months, that the CCP virus is causing blood clots and then strokes and or heart attacks. This is occurring in the younger and older people being infected by it. Naturally, that's a problem, but when you add on to this that there is now inflammation involved in the form of blood clotting and the rash we're seeing here, we have a problem. This is caused by the red blood cells leaking out from where they should be inside the capillaries and getting in under the skin. This is where that coloration comes from. It's similar to what happens with a bruise. You must now add this rash to the list of other complications, which includes mental disorders, fertility, long-term harm to the lung functionality, heart function, and more, all from what was originally a disease we could have controlled and managed to some extent. While on the topic of controlling it, we should talk about the Russian vaccine. Russia claims to have been able to push out a vaccine to the CCP virus. The problem we have is that there are a lot of questions about its safety, and especially from the World Health Organization, who want to review the results of Russia's clinical trials for it. The final clinical trial for this particular vaccine started on Wednesday, but Russia is already declaring it their first approved vaccine. It is one of 28 that are currently undergoing testing, and one of more than 150 that are in potential contention for being deployed as the treatment, or at least the first available treatment for the CCP virus. Last week we mentioned a video that showed you just which kind of mask, when you were making your own, was most effective, and how to test these. Well, now there's something that's taken that several steps further, and has tested a battery of different types of mask. This has allowed them to figure out just how much protection is offered by 14 different mask types. And surprisingly, the N95 mask is most effective. Then there were things like surgical masks, which again are industrially developed and heavily tested to ensure quality. Then there were things like cotton, which was surprisingly effective. Finally, at the lowest end of the spectrum, you had between having no face mask and having a fleece-made one. Their experimental apparatus is really quite interesting for what it is and how it works. It involves a laser and what is effectively a light box. People would then speak through a mask into this light box, and it would be able to detect the various droplets that would come out, and they could then be recorded. That allowed them to give an ideal measure of just how much is coming out of someone's mouth and through a mask based on what they are wearing, and then they could standardize this to a simple measure of an arbitrary but relevant unit compared to what they were hoping or not hoping to see. In the context of spreading the CCP virus, we should note that New Zealand has marked 100 days without any serious cases of the CCP virus being transmitted. There have been several active cases, but none have been considered a breakout or any kind of real development. The authorities have found them, been able to control them, and prevent spread. Their biggest concern recently has been the return of some overseas travellers who were found to be positive for the CCP virus and had to be put into quarantine of a sorts. That is the worst New Zealand has faced, and yet just about every other country has had difficulty in getting the CCP virus under control. We already mentioned a vaccine for the CCP virus, but now we should talk about one for the common cold. Your common cold is another kind of coronavirus. Unlike the CCP virus, it is nowhere near as aggressive or deadly. It can still cause fatalities, but most of the time it leads to being miserable for a few days to a few weeks, after which you recover and have some degree of immunity to it. Compared to the CCP virus, your common cold is more dangerous for children than it is adults, as it causes lower respiratory diseases in them. One of the problems we've been facing is that It is a diverse family of viruses, and so developing a vaccine is extremely difficult. A vaccine that is too broad would activate the immune system to too many things and possibly create problems with self-immunity or autoimmune diseases. It could also not activate enough of the immune system, and therefore it would not be rallied to fight off the virus. When you combine that with the sheer number of things that would need to go into such a vaccine, it was often considered an impossible hurdle. It's hoped that this German-based vaccine might be available by 2024 and is currently undergoing evaluation by the FDA. Going now from the hopeful news of a vaccine to the rather depressing news about the Aricebo observatory. A 76mm thick cable at the Aricebo observatory in Puerto Rico has torn through the large dish. This has left a 100-foot or 30-meter hole in the massive radio telescope. The radio telescope itself covers an area of more than 20 acres. That is roughly 81,000 square meters. Understand that this is a 76mm thick steel cable. Anything under that much tension would have a lot of force behind it, and when that force is suddenly released, it can be extremely violent. A process we have understood since ancient times when we built basic catapults and ballistas using ropes under tension. They were made from sinew, a much weaker material than the steel. And the platform itself was also made from metal, so you have to understand how much force was behind this tearing cable to tear its way through a steel platform. While talking about space and looking into it, there's also been some update on the Starlink issue and its controversy around the satellites it's deploying. We recently mentioned how these satellites ruined an attempt to take a photo of space where you could see them cutting across the image and leaving lines. In the meantime, SpaceX has been trying to find a way to deal with this. One of their options has been to add what they call sunshades. The idea behind these is that they are there to block out sunlight and prevent it from reflecting off the satellite's surface. This would avoid them being shiny and bright in the sky, at least in theory. In an effort to try and counteract some of the other danger that this can have for astronomy, SpaceX is sharing the Starlink's orbital path data with astronomers so they can plan how their telescopes will work, or in the case of photography, close the shutters on them to ensure that the exposure isn't ruined by a single second-long moving object in a minutes-long exposure. Going now from technology designed to see things incredibly far away to the technology designed to see things incredibly close up. There's a video out there from a recent look into how shaving will dull your razor. Now you might think that the hair on your face is soft enough that the sharp steel of a razor should cut through it with relative ease. Anyone who has tried to use a razor for any extended period would know that no matter how sharp your razor starts, it does not end that way, and that the hair on your face will gradually dull it. That the amount of time you have between the blade being dull and the blade being sharp enough to use without cutting your face into small pieces is going to vary considerably. The scientists involved were able to do this by using a scanning electron microscope, an incredibly powerful and sophisticated piece of equipment. It operates in a similar manner to a light microscope, but can get much clearer images at a much smaller resolution, allowing for more finite and refined imaging. This is important when we're looking at something like how a metal blade interacts with hairs. A hair on your face is a fraction of a millimeter. If you're looking at an entire razor blade's length, that's many hair lengths wide, but also, if you were to try this with any other kind of microscope, you wouldn't be able to get the refined image needed. Fortunately, they were able to do exactly this, and they made a series of videos showing exactly what is happening. The simplest summary of what they found was that the blades did not chip and dull when the hair was being cut perpendicular to the blade. It happened when the hairs on your face would bend. That is what made the chipping more likely. The blade edge would come in contact with the sides of the hair strand, and that is what led to it becoming damaged and worn. This is compounded by differences in how the steel is made. Steel weaknesses and strengths that vary along the blade's length would then influence how likely it was to chip or not. Finally, there was stress intensification, which is where there is a small amount of microscopic damage in the form of cracks. When these came in contact with the hair, in combination with the steel's varying quality along its length, you wound up with the damage that you see. The final piece of news we have for you this week is about the impending global coffee crisis. The issue is that it's becoming more difficult to grow coffee. This owes to a variety of conditions ranging from global warming and climate change through to the availability of water and soil. Coffee is, at least generally, a notoriously difficult plant to grow. It needs very specific conditions, and it's one reason why it only grew in certain areas for a very long time. It's only after it became widely popular that it disseminated to other places, where it became a sort of staple crop and was grown in large quantities. Currently, it's thought that by 2050 the amount of land available to grow coffee will have decreased by 50%. That means our possible coffee supply will have up to have halved in that time, and that's only 30 years away. As much of a filthy rag as Vox is, they do provide a good summary in this video of just what's happening with the coffee production, and why it is so difficult to both keep it going, and how those who are currently doing so are likely to face ever-growing challenges in trying to get coffee to grow in where their locations are, and to sell it at a reasonable profit. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.